Frank. Part 1. I've always liked estate sales. I remember the first one I went to. My high school bestie and I were driving around the cornfield smoking a bowl and passed signs for what turned out to be a barn filled with vintage. Relics, all for $1 or $2. I've since stopped when I see one, but I never went out of my way to look for them until I was with Frank. We went to lots of sales together, some weird and memorable, others so bland it made me wonder who these uninspired people living in this gray and white home could even be. But this home that sat alone in the countryside, blocked off from view until you were halfway up the winding driveway, I knew it would be memorable as I drove up. It was a wood-paneled, floor-to-ceiling, windowed mid-century dream. Inside was musty and muggy, no air conditioning. It was a 90-degree summer day, and the June bugs were crowing or whatever that noise is. I followed the bright orange shag carpet into a high-ceilinged room with a full wall window so you could see the forest out back. I shifted through the piles of clothes that spilled off the couch onto the floor and found a soft jean cotton 90s puffer. I draped it over my arm. Off the living room was a bedroom filled with wood furniture and a rainbow mattress in those brown-orange 70s hues, and a computer room with a badly stained pea-green carpet. Several computers and keypads lie on the floor. Frank would have liked this place. I wondered if he had been here. It was only about 30 minutes from his house. Though if he had, he would have come yesterday, right as it opened, not the second day in the afternoon. He was a reseller. He made a decent living doing it too. More than decent. It might not sound like you could make much doing that, but you could if you had a 5,000 square foot house and you filled every inch of it with stuff from sales to the point where you can't use your kitchen or sit anywhere. Actually, when I first stepped into his house a little over a year ago, it wasn't quite that bad. The kitchen was mostly clear. You could walk down the hall without clutching your purse tight to your side so it didn't brush up against a box and cause an avalanche. His house was the first big house I loved. I used to think little houses were for me, something cute, quaint, easy to decorate. But I loved his giant house with its grand wooden staircase. The first floor he turned into a library. 3 huge rooms lined to the ceiling with shelving and books. Frank sold all sorts of things, but his main focus was books. The wide halls had built-in brass candle holders, and each of the 4 bedrooms had its own fireplace. The basement had a concrete swimming pool that had a giant whale-stuffed animal sitting in it when I first came over. Now it was packed with box upon box. Sorry, I am describing 2 houses at once. You may not even like to read house descriptions. Back in the estate sale house, I followed the orange carpet up the stairs and turned into a bedroom. This room had soft yellow popcorn carpet and a white Victorian mirror and vanity. I picked up a plastic Snoopy comb with long, soft bristles. There were piles of clothes on the bed, mostly stained and dirty. The good clothes were in the closet, several 70s cotton button-ups and some men's polyester tunics in bold colors. These would sell well. I made a pile and was exiting the room when I heard voices downstairs. Up until then, I had been alone in the house. "Do you think it's worth going upstairs and seeing?" "No," a man said firmly. Something in the urgency of this man's no made me suddenly realize how filthy the place was. My arms felt itchy. I'm a messy person, so sometimes it's hard for me to judge if something's just sloppy or actually unclean, but I was already in. If there were bugs, they were already on me. I followed the L-shaped hallway around the corner. I found what seemed to be someone's arts and sewing room. I grabbed a few more pieces on the floor, some men's striped bell-bottoms, a few slips, another button-up. I went back downstairs and exited out the garage. "You got a pile there," said the man who had greeted me when I first came in. "I do. I'm not sure I can afford it all." "You can afford it," his buddy assured me. "We got you. You sure you don't want more? You can set those down and go back in. I think I have everything." He flipped through the clothes, holding the bolder pieces out for the other man to see. I commented how much I loved the house. It wasn't theirs, he told me. They were hired. Professional estate salesman. He asked $50 for the clothes. I was afraid of something like this. At most sales, clothes were $1 a piece, maybe 2. But when they're unpriced, that's when you have to watch out. I looked over at the second guy to see if he thought this was a deal, but he held a good poker face. "How about 30? I offered, "and I'll put the 2 coats back." I locked eyes with him in a firm but soft way, as if to say, "Yes, I live with a lot of anxiety, but I'm not particularly afraid of you." "I want you to have those coats," he said. "You keep those coats, and let's do 40. "Okay," I said. Driving home, I went back and forth on whether I got ripped. I was kicking myself for complimenting the house. It was hard to breathe in there, and I probably had bed bugs now. But ultimately, I decided 40 wasn't bad for that pile. There were some unique finds for sure. I might be a little spoiled now from some of the sales I've been to. I remember one sale. This lady had racks and racks of vintage tops and dresses. I picked out 8 or so at first, but Frank kept telling me, "Get more, grab more." By the end, I had a pile that wouldn't even fit in my trunk. When the lady priced me, I couldn't believe it. She wanted $20 for maybe 50 articles. I know it sounds silly, but I was sick to my stomach the rest of the day. Most people get a high from that sort of deal, Frank told me. I knew that by most people, he meant him. 40 was fine. I'd profit at least $100, and I was keeping the 90s puffer coat. Besides, I had that house now. In what way I had it, I wasn't sure, but I connected with it, and it was mine. Its first use I found later that day. I posted a picture from the estate house to Instagram for Frank to see. He wouldn't be able to see it right now. I had him blocked to show him how serious I was about being gone. But one day I would unblock, and eventually he would notice. And if he had been to that sale, which I had a feeling he had, he would think, "I remember that house. I was at that sale." And my picture would be a way of saying, "See, I'm still living with you side by side." That night when I lay in bed, I started to clean the estate sale house in my head. I started in the living room with the glass window wall and cleared all the clothes off the couch. Then I went into the office with the pea green carpet. I got rid of the spare computers but kept one on the table, an old desktop. I picked out a screensaver for it, one that was on my family's computer when I was a kid. I went into the library and put in all my favorite books, saving room for books I could resell. It was looking good except the stain on the carpet. I couldn't seem to imagine it not there. I had the same issue in the front hall, where I tried to clear the long tables of knickknacks. They'd disappear for a second, and then pop back up. I sat down on the living room couch to rest. It was a big, beautiful room with high slanted ceilings. I put a Kali statue in the corner. Then I put a wax figure of Frank next to me on the couch. He was leaning too far forward, which I didn't love but couldn't change. And he looked at least his age. 39. Frank was someone whose face held all sorts of different ages, depending on his mood. He was 23 the first time I met him, but then we didn't see each other for 16 years. No social media, nothing. So I didn't know what to expect when I went to his house the second time. "You look the same," I commented as I walked up his porch steps. Maybe he didn't look 23, but he looked young. "So do you," he smiled. 16 years. We could have both looked awful. We're lucky ones. Then there was this one time, sorry, I'm jumping around. This one time half a year in. I was going to break up with him because I felt he was lying about something. We fought by phone for a week, and finally I agreed to let him come by. Before he got to my house, my forehead did this thing it sometimes does, where it gets warm in the center. It feels like I'm about to have a premonition, but all that really happens is my mind gets quiet and still. I leaned into the blankness. I had this feeling that when he got here, when I opened the door, I would be able to see the truth on his face. When I opened the door, he looked straight up like a teenager, maybe 17. I told him this shortly after letting him in, about the hot spot and how young he looked. "Yeah," he said after some thought, "I am around 17. He seemed to understand the significance of this. He felt seen even. I felt like a good partner for seeing him, and I felt like he was a good partner for understanding it all. That's what the hotspot was trying to tell me, I thought. It doesn't matter if he was lying. We were both good partners in our own way. This other time, though, I came to his house, and we took a mushroom microdose, only it was a little too large for a microdose. I call this the no zone. Not enough to trip, but just enough to make you feel wiry and uncomfortable. He went to take a shower, and I wandered around his house, not really knowing what to do with myself. After he dressed, he turned a corner into the hallway I was standing in. It was dark, and he didn't see me, and in this moment he looked so old, hunched over even. He looked tired and sad, and I felt a knot of guilt because I was supposed to be helping him have fun, but all I was doing was standing stiffly in a dark hallway. The Frank I saw in the hallway that day was the Frank the wax statue on the estate sale house couch was molded from. I knelt on the couch beside Wax Frank. He had holes in his ears big enough that you could peek in and see the hollow inside was coated with some sort of aluminum. This contraption led to the real Frank's brain, I decided. If you said something into the gaping ear, he could maybe hear, depending on how cluttered his mind was at the time. I thought for a while what I should say to him. There was a lot to express, and I was feeling expressive. But first I need to slow down and tell you more about this person and why I couldn't talk to him anymore except through a wax head. And none of that can be explained without explaining Magdans. A Magdan is a moment you share with someone where you are both fully connected, contented, and everything is exactly as it should be. They're usually brief and hard to come by. You can have a Magdan on your own, a moment where everything feels perfect, but it's not as satisfying as a shared Magdan. There is no specific reason why this is called a Magdan. It's just the first sound that popped in my head when I decided this phenomenon needed a name. It happens that the first time I met Frank, when I was 19 and he was 23, we shared 2 Magdans. 2 might not sound like a lot, but we had only hung out for a few weeks. And I was a highly anxious teenager, which made Magdans difficult to come by. These Magdans were the reason I looked Frank up 16 years later. I was rebounding from a 2-year relationship with a man that I had trouble connecting with. In fact, me and this guy, Jared, had only 2 Magdans in 2 years. One was after we took our cat to the vet. Something about presenting our shared devotion for the cat to the doctor brought out something between us. The other one happened when we went downtown Portland to see the cherry blossoms. We needed to use the porta potty, which we were feeling apprehensive about. And when we opened the stall, the toilet was filled a good 5 inches above the brim, with one cartoonish-looking curly log sitting on top like whipped cream. "Oh God," I exclaimed. "Oh my God. Who did that last one? Who topped it off? Why did they do it?" I slammed the door shut, and this partner looked at me thoughtfully and said, "I liked your reaction to that." I don't know why, but it was a Magdan. Then we had a Magdan afterglow as we walked along the cherry blossoms hand in hand, me sort of gaily chattering and feeling liked, cherished even, by this man who was usually scowling. By the time we were walking back to his car, we remembered who we were, a Tinder couple who sort of got stuck together during the pandemic. So yeah, I know it's kind of strange to look up someone you dated 16 years ago, but I remembered the easy Magdans, and I thought, that's the sort of person I'm supposed to be with. And Frank didn't disappoint. In the year we spent together, we had loads of Magdans. More than I've ever had with anyone else. That's what nobody gets when I talk about my relationship with Frank. People think it's an open-shut case. Someone implies they might murder you, you stay away, move on. But they don't understand about the Magdans. We were having one a day, or at least a couple a week. The more tender ones were at night where I would be the big spoon, him holding my hand pressed against his stomach and talking softly. But we were having them even in the Taco Bell drive-through line. We were having them everywhere, and this was not that quiet of a guy. I used to think the more introverted and still a person was, the easier to have a Magdan with. But Frank wasn't like that. He was just tuned in. We had this one Magdan in his office. I would sit in a chair to the side of his desk while he listed his sale finds, and for some reason, I think the conversation started with something he saw on Twitter about child sexual abuse. He told me about this neighbor girl that got on top of him when they were 5 or so. He pointed out that someone must have taught her that, some adult. And I don't know if I brought it up or he did, something I had told him before about my grandpa, and he was saying, "But you're not sure, right? You sort of think something happened, but you said you weren't sure." "No, it happened." "Ooh, yeah, I think just that, W-ons. I'm sorry that happened to you. We were looking at each other and I'm not sure who cracked a smile first. But remember, this was a Magden, so it's not impossible that we both grinned at the same time, and then we chuckled. Not like some huge, doubled-over laughter, but a casual chuckle, and then the subject changed. I can't be sure why we grinned and laughed now that I'm not in that Magden anymore. Sometimes details get lost when a Magden ends, but I think it had something to do with how much darkness is in everything to the point where it doesn't make sense to use one thing to represent all this. I also think we were nodding at the fact that most people, if you tell them something like that, they might be straining awkwardly trying to come up with the right response. But we weren't most people, and we didn't have to worry about stuff like that, especially during a Magden. But anyways, the wax head. I wanted to say something into it before falling asleep. I didn't need a perfect line, I decided, because I could say something into it every night for as long as I needed. I leaned forward, my mouth almost touching the wax ear, and said, "Why are you like this?" I said it just once, and then I ran up the shag carpet steps and into the bedroom where I had found all the blouses. I didn't bother cleaning this room. I didn't even take the clothes off the mattress. I just sort of kicked them around to make way for my body and went to sleep. Part 2. While Frank led me through a parade of estate sales, I introduced him to mausoleums. My interest in mausoleums didn't feel morbid to me. They were beautiful. And more importantly, they were quiet. Quiet is the name of a book by Susan Cain about the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking. I feel like our society is constantly rewarding extroverts and shaming quiet people like me, to the point where an introvert's place is at home while the extroverts are free to roam a land made just for them. But a mausoleum, that's somewhere where you can go and be quiet. If someone is being loud, you can side-eye them even. Let them know that their behavior isn't status quo. My first visit to a mausoleum happened by chance. I was on the outskirts of Portland, sort of out in the country. This was when I massaged people in their homes. I had just finished one and the next appointment wasn't for a few hours. So I stopped at a taco truck, got a couple tacos, and drove. I didn't know where I was driving to, but I wanted to find a pretty spot to sit. When I saw the graveyard, I pulled over. I found a patch of grass to sit in and ate my tacos. There was a large building to the side that I assumed was a church, but didn't give much thought to until I needed to use the bathroom. I didn't think it would be open. There were no cars parked out front, but it was worth a shot. When I stepped in, I was in awe. The front entrance had these vintage green upholstered chairs, an archway leading to a gold and white trimmed room with vaulted walls, and 8 or so pews. Facing a display of vases and flowers, behind the display were 2 winding staircases, one on each side. After I went to the bathroom, I went up one of the winding staircases and wandered. I felt so at peace. My body and soul felt quiet. Afterwards, I went back outside and called my dad. He chatted about a concert he went to, and then he mentioned his Aunt Jeannie, who turned 92 recently. I can't imagine living that long, I told him honestly. I already feel like I've been alive for such a long time. My dad let out a deep laugh. To me, you're a young pup. I really did feel like it was impossible to imagine my future. Or maybe it was my future with Jared, my COVID boyfriend that I couldn't imagine. After the call, I still had some time to kill, so I went back inside and sat down in the pews. I thought about Jared some more. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to take pictures in a mausoleum, but I took a shot of the front room and sent it to him. I got a text back almost immediately. It said, "I'm at the movies with my parents. The whole thing takes place on a train. I want to take a long train trip soon. Maybe to Chicago? We'll talk more when I get home." My text only reminded him that he had something to say at me. He didn't care what I was up to. That mausoleum was where I finally admitted I needed to break it off. We had a strange arrangement, Jared and I, after we broke up. I was planning to move back home, a cross-county move that would take a lot of planning, so he offered that I continue living with him for a couple months. Actually, he suggested I stay all summer, but I wanted to go in July so I'd have some warmth while getting situated in my new place. For the remainder of my time there, the two of us acted like we were still dating. We fell asleep spooning. We hung out during the day. It was almost as if nothing had changed, except sometimes we'd talk about the move. During this time, I started hanging out with Alex, an Instagram friend that, up until that point, I had never met in person. He was my ideal friend. He liked to talk about books. He lived in a big apartment complex with a creek behind it, and his Instagram often had pictures of ducks. Right now, there's a mom with a bunch of babies, he told me. Want to see if we can find them? We walked around the parameters of the pond while he blew on his homemade duck whistle. I avoided looking into mirrors when I was at his house. I felt like we were around 10 and I didn't want to spoil it. He told me he was autistic and could get a little cranky if he didn't do the same things at the same time every day. Like at 5:30, he needed to take a bath for 20 to 30 minutes. I sat on the couch and waited for him the first time. But after that, I got in and sat between his legs, resting my back on his chest. There was nothing sexual about our baths. One of them we spent describing our dads. Mine wore a tan trench coat and matching rain hat in the 90s, I told him. I think I'm picturing him exactly, Alex remarked. To me, these baths brought a deeper comfort than anything sex could offer. I did get Alex to break free from his self-imposed schedule one day. It was too beautiful of a day to stay indoors, and he lived a 5-minute drive from Selwood Park, which he somehow had never even heard of. I'm taking you right now, I said. We started our walk at the bottom by the dog beach and winded the upward trail through the woods. There's a mausoleum up here I've never been to. Actually, I've been wanting to see it before I move. The hike ended at the top near the mausoleum, and as we made our way there, we saw a line of people outside waiting to get in. It's Memorial Day, Alex remembered. How odd to sort of stumble our way to the mausoleum on Memorial Day. The Selwood Mausoleum was 3.5 blocks long. Inside, it had solid marble walls and hand-carved ceilings. A few rooms had stained glass ceilings. One room we entered had a giant fountain a couple children were skipping around. The experience of seeing it so crowded was a nice send-off from Portland. And as much as I liked Alex as a friend, I realized this situation was perfect for us, one where I could slip off before more was asked from me. Frank and I visited 3 mausoleums together. One we went to the first time he came to my house. He came to town the night before, and we walked around and stopped into a coffee shop. I was being painfully shy and knew I was acting much different from the weekend before when I got wildly drunk at his place. Sitting in a dead coffee shop, I looked at him, then down at my coffee. There was a moment like this I had with my first 2 loves too. A moment at the very beginning where I had nothing to say to the point where it was agonizing. It felt like our whole relationship was slipping through my fingers, all because my mind was completely blank. Somehow I got through it, all 3 times. I think maybe I need to see that someone's willing to sit in a deep pocket of silence with me before I can relax. Frank slept over that night, and the next day I did feel more relaxed. He asked me to show him around. I lived in a city an hour from his, but I had only just moved there myself. There was a mausoleum I passed a few times that I'd been meaning to check out. Did he want to do that? He did. The mausoleum was small but cute. It had yellow, white, and brown stained glass windows near the podium and pews. I was surprised at first by the abundance of fresh flowers. Frank pointed out that tomorrow was Memorial Day, so they had probably just been set out. Wait, Memorial Day's tomorrow? I thought of Alex. There's a certain type of person who, when you're with them, idiosyncrasies happen. Alex and Frank were both such people. Frank especially seemed to have an air of magic about him. We walked through holding hands and looking at the engraved walls. We were silent for a while as we strolled slowly, but this wasn't the strained silence of the coffee shop the night before. This was a quiet Magdon. Life was so funny, I thought to myself. Last night I was so shy and uncomfortable I almost wanted to cry. Now I couldn't feel more content. We walked past a spot with a rancid smell. "Do you think that smell is?" I stopped and was sort of taking the smell in. He tugged my hand, wanting to keep moving. "Yeah," his voice was shaky, which I found adorable. "That's that smell. If you're ever in someone's house and you smell that smell, get out." "How does this happen? There's a leak in the wall and the casket?" "I guess. Let's go. It's just in that one spot. Like as soon as you pass that spot, you can't smell it anymore." Yeah. I walked past it again. I'd never smelled that kind of rotting before. I wanted to look at how long ago this person died, but it was hard to say exactly which stone it was coming from. It could have been one of a handful. None of the dates are new. We could be smelling someone who died 60 years ago, I mused. "Do you think we should tell someone? I mean, there's going to be a parade of people in here tomorrow." "Yeah, we should maybe," he said, "but who? I don't know. I really do want to go now," he said again. Okay. I was glad Frank decided to stay another night, because that night in bed, I felt the horror that hadn't hit me when I first smelled the smell. It seemed like a novelty then. But now, in the dark, I felt like the smell really meant something. About me, about everyone. We were all decaying already. It starts while we're still alive. And even worse, I felt I had disrespected the dead by getting a second sniff. "I feel like whoever's body was making that smell is in the room with us," I whispered. He said he felt weird too, but his voice was steady. He seemed fine. I was experiencing a kind of panicked fear I hadn't felt since I was a child, like I could almost pass out. A couple weeks later, he took me to the mausoleum down the street from his house. He had been to the graveyard many times because his grandparents were there, but he'd never gone. Into the mausoleum. As we walked up, we saw a bone on the ground. Frank bent over and picked it up. "A finger?" he asked. "No," I said. "That's gotta be a chicken bone." Someone was standing outside the mausoleum eating chicken. Must have been on a date like us. I looked closer at the bone. It really did look like a human metacarpal. I've taken anatomy twice, but that didn't make me a bone expert. This mausoleum was especially tiny, just one room. There wasn't much to see, but we did sit down for a bit in the pews. That night, Frank gave me a gorgeous floor-length Victorian nightgown, white with a scooped-back laced top, one of his sale finds. "Now you match the house," he said. I looked like a ghost. And the house did look like it should have a wandering ghost. He left to check in on his dad and was in a mood when he returned, a strange mix of frantic and sedated. Was he drunk? He smoked weed, but at this point, I'd only seen him drunk that first night we met up. We laid on our backs on his bed. The fireplace in his room was painted baby pink, and he used this for his headboard. I always felt safe and cozy with my head up by it. "I want to fill you in on how I grew up," he told me. When Frank was growing up, his dad went to the bar every night after work. He and his brother shared a room and would be tucked in by the time Dad got home, but Frank wouldn't be sleeping. He would be waiting for the sound of the garage door to open, and then the fighting. Sometimes it was bad. About twice a week, his mom would burst into their bedroom, scoop up his little brother, and tell Frank to follow close behind her as they'd shuffle past his enraged father. Get into the car and go to his grandparents' house. Sometimes he would beat her, and she'd ask Frank to take pictures of the bruises. Once little Frank came home from a friend's house and the cops were in his driveway. His dad, in handcuffs, gave a weak smile and a little wave from the cuffs. His mom got a restraining order, and he could only see his dad on supervised visits at his aunt's house. His aunt had a pool, and after swimming, she'd give the boys a handful of Cheetos on a napkin and a little juice box. After a few months, his dad came back home and the cycle started over. While he spoke, I imagined this happening in the house his dad lived in now, where Frank had lived when I first met him, but that's not where they lived then. He had already shown me his childhood home. His backyard was connected to the parking lot of a pizza place I used to go to with my family. "Do you remember a kid in the pool ever waving to you?" He had asked as we peeped over the fence into his old yard. We would wave to anyone getting out of their car. I'm not someone who would remember a detail like that, but I liked the thought that we had been living side by side all this time. He fell asleep quickly after telling me everything, his leg draped over mine and his head on my chest. I brushed his thick curly hair with my fingers, this middle-aged teen child of mine. I was all sticky. It was too hot out to be wearing a floor-length nightgown. Drizzles of sweat ran down my leg like we'd just had sex, only I was firmly in my body. If we had just had sex, I'd be somewhere on the outside waiting till I was sure it was safe to return. The second time he told me about the visitations and the swimming pool, we were at his dad's. I was looking at a photo on the fridge, little Frank in a Garfield shirt, his brother in stripes and dorky glasses, and his dad standing between them with his hand planted proudly on Frank's head. That was from when we had to have supervised visits. He told the story over again, Cheetos on napkins and all. Around the fourth time, he talked about the visitations he was starting to get under my skin. We were driving home from dinner, and I was noticing how he'd always say supervised visits. His accenting the first syllable somehow expressing how bullshit he thought the whole thing was. Well, my mom left for a whole year when I was 7, and for good when I was 15, I shot at him. This was followed by silence and bitterness on both sides. I had liked, at first, that he talked a lot about his childhood. I wanted to know him. But it was starting to feel like everything that happened in his life was monumental, while my life wasn't even worth mentioning. But this instance was my fault. I hadn't waited for the right moment to tell him my mom dipped. I had used it to silence him, and I supposed him never asking questions about my life was his way of saying, "Fuck you for not understanding how deep my wound is," which maybe I deserved. So I brushed it off. We were going to finish this life out together, I thought. I would have loads of time later to tell him all about me. Do you want to know when I decided we were destined to finish out our lives together? It was on our third mausoleum visit. Actually, this one we discovered on arrival. You couldn't get in without a passcode, but we peered through windows. It looked like a bookstore with comfy-looking armchairs and sculptures. There were a few walls outside, so we walked around. One of the stones, 3 rows up from the top, was open. They were preparing to put someone in. The headstone sat on the ground. It read a man's name, birth and death date, and a woman's name, birth but no death date yet. "She must have just died," Frank said. "They're going to fit them both in there together? Where is he right now?" "They took him out?" I asked. "It was just a gaping hole the size of a casket in the wall." "It looks like there's room to stack them," he answers. "Hey," my voice is echoing from the hole. "Stand right here." I stood by him, and we both spoke, our voices echoing from inside the empty tomb. Something else was happening too in this moment. A Magdan, sort of, but with a different feel. It felt premonition-like. I felt I was being told by the universe that Frank and I would be buried together. Thinking of that now concerns me a little. Like me and Frank's death will be linked in some way. But I keep reminding myself, I have to admit that I can get a bit overly imaginative and obsessive. I was obsessed with Frank when I met him at 19, and I was even more so at this point. And there have been others. It was suggested to me by my therapist that I may have a love addiction. My old therapist, Luca, has been on my mind ever since I've started sleeping in that estate sale house I cleaned up in my head. I haven't been speaking in Wax Frank's ear or even going down to the first floor, but I could sense him down there. The concept of this reminded me of when I was telling Luca I was having anxiety at work. I feel okay when my clients are on the table, but when they're dressed and moving about, I get uneasy, I told him. He asked if I needed help coming up with a coping strategy for when this happens, but I already had one. I imagine I'm standing in a house, the front entrance to my childhood neighbor's house, where we used to sit to take off or put on our shoes. "That's smart," he told me. "You're right, I am smart. I was trying to be fun and flirty. This therapist got my jokes and never misunderstood my tone. He was tall, bald, 3 years older than me, and I was in love. There were a couple repeat fantasies I was having about him. One was that some worldwide catastrophic event happened, and he had somehow been separated from his family, and we were for some reason lying in a tent, and he has his back to me and is crying, and I'm rubbing his back. The other is that we are in a completely pitch dark room with a bunch of people, and everyone is feeling around trying to find someone. No one can speak or make a sound. I'm feeling around, but I don't know who for. And then him and I are next to each other, and his hands are all over my face, and I'm squeezing his shoulders. And this is when we both realize that we are each other's person. I had some sex fantasies too, sure, but not many. When he recommended a podcast about love addiction, my cheeks went pink. I felt like he could sense the fantasy worlds I had placed him in. My therapist was not one of my big loves, though. I knew he would have never let me sit on his lap or kiss him. I felt around all his borders to see what he'd let me do, and I could sense that it was pretty much nothing. I could sit across from him, and I could say anything I wanted. That was what he had for me. I wasn't ungrateful. I wondered what he would say now about my imaginary house, but I hadn't talked to him in years. Would he think it was healthy? Would he think it was smart? You're in your head too much. What? Who's saying that? It's me. An old slipper you wore as a kid? I'm a jelly shoe, a slipper. You have to get out of that house. You're going to get murdered. Part 3. I sat on the couch in his dad's hospital room, facing the foot of the bed. Frank paced, adjusted his dad's pillow, and greeted the new nurse. One was about to clock out and was introducing the other. Frank's voice sounded different as he spoke to them. Was this his real voice? Had I never heard it before? I was feeling like I didn't belong there, like an intruder. On the way to the hospital, I had called my work and said, I can't come in tomorrow. My partner's dad is having an emergency triple bypass. And it was true, wasn't it? This was my partner. We had talked about getting a place together, somewhere we could live free from the sale clutter, but now that didn't feel real. His dad was sick. He was kissing his dad's head, that was real. The doctor came in, followed by a young doctor in training. He went over the procedure and asked some questions. He wanted to know how many drinks he had per week. This is a routine question, right? But it felt accusatory. Frank and his dad sort of mumbled and fumbled. I, who had been completely silent, looked down to the ground as a way of somehow being even more silent. Maybe a pint, his dad said. A pint? A pint of beer? Whiskey. It's not that much, Frank interjected. I would know. I have to buy it for him. Are we talking pint of whiskey a day or a week? The doctor asked. He has maybe a glass a day, just one glass a day. And then the real questions. What if something went wrong during the surgery? Did he want to be put on life support? His dad dodged this question, veering off into other subjects. The doctor kept bringing the conversation back, asking again. I have this issue with my massage clients all the time. They'll be telling me about their bad shoulder, and I'll ask if they want to focus just on the shoulders and the surrounding muscles, or would they like to do a full body massage? Yeah, sure. That's fine, they'll say, or they'll go into some ramble. I went golfing this Sunday. Pretty nice out there. I may have slept weird on it too. This used to drive me mad. Why won't they tell me if they want a full body or a focus massage? But now when that happens, I just do whichever I feel like. This wasn't like that, of course. The doctor can't do whichever he pleases just because the patient wouldn't answer the question. His dad never did answer. The doc left. It was just us and the nurse. The three of them talked. Frank was wearing a pair of gray sweatpants, and I noticed his ass looked great. I don't even usually look at men's asses like that. Women's asses, sure. I've never made any claim to the gay community or even called myself bi because it seemed like something more would be required of me than just being attracted to women's bodies. I felt like I would have to read some core books or have specific opinions on things that had nothing to do with asses. Or maybe I didn't want to join the community for a similar reason I didn't join in any sort of groups. I was afraid if the gay or bi community could look into my gaping ear and see the insides of my head, they would say, Yes, we can see you want to nuzzle your face between a fat woman's ass cheeks, but we still don't like you. Frank had built up some extra poundage, and it looked good. He really was a gorgeous man, though maybe an acquired taste. You'd really have to understand the subtle way all the ages played out on his face like sequins reflecting different light as they move. I shouldn't have been thinking about his body at that moment, though. Someone who belonged in this room wouldn't be thinking about that. When the nurse left, I motioned Frank to sit down by me. He did for about 10 seconds, then popped back up. I made some small talk about what was on TV, and after half an hour or so, we got ready to leave. It was close to midnight. His dad motioned me to bring over a pair of socks that were folded together by the TV, a blue pair of those hospital socks with the grippers at the bottom. You want to change them? I asked him. Tomorrow, put them here, he motioned to the side table next to him. I really like this sort of thing about old people. He's looking forward to his socks getting changed tomorrow, and he wanted them brought over closer to him. It's similar to a childlike wonderment, but about mundane things like socks. I really didn't dislike his dad like I think they thought I did. Yes, I got upset with him here and there. I got really mad when he called me a whore. If an old man I didn't know had gotten up in my face like that, and I mean he got really close and said, "Does a whore like you ever feel satisfied?" and then made gross noises like someone getting fucked, I would have kicked him hard in the stomach. He would have been on the ground, but this was Frank's dad, so I didn't kick him. Instead, I looked at Frank. This was his responsibility. He looked away. Later, when I asked him why he didn't say anything, he said it wouldn't make a difference. That's just what dad's like, he said. This was towards the middle of me realizing this family had boundary issues. They could do and say anything they liked to each other with only one rule, and that's that nobody tries to make a rule or put down any boundary. It was an issue between us that I wanted him to speak up if his dad said something like that. I was trying to insert a boundary. I was the problem. I had a weird urge to squeeze his dad's feet or change his socks. Why wait, I could have said. Let's get those puppies in some fresh socks now. But I didn't. I was still feeling out of place. I do wonder, though, if I had changed his socks, if maybe Frank wouldn't have been so mean to me after his dad died. I believe that sometimes really small things can change big things in big ways. Like in movies when you go into the past. If you do something small, like maybe throw something in the garbage that was supposed to be thrown on the ground, that could somehow result in a whole person not being born. Maybe me and Frank would have stayed together. We could have been one of those happy old couples that smile at each other in public like they have a secret. And then, maybe, this could have been my last incarnation having finally found an inner peace. If only I had changed those socks from yellow to blue. There was thick tension in bed that night. To a peeping Tom, it would have looked like Frank was holding me and we were sleeping. But we weren't sleeping. And I could feel an intense heat coming off him, like he could spontaneously combust. They told us in school that could happen. In the morning, I dropped him back off at the hospital. His brother was meeting him there, so I took his dog and went to my dad's for the day. They didn't end up doing his operation as planned. They said it would be too risky because he had a kidney infection. After that is sort of a blur, especially since I wasn't there. I was just getting text messages that didn't make much sense to me. Something about tubes in his throat and blood and an emergency surgery to stop the bleeding, but the surgery didn't help. Or maybe it didn't happen. Maybe there wasn't time. And now he was on a ventilator and they couldn't take him off because his blood pressure was too low. By the next morning, he was gone. Pause. Characters in classic novels never get over their true love. In Wuthering Heights, Catherine locks herself in her room and dies of starvation when she's told she can never see Heathcliff again. Scarlett O'Hara, in Gone with the Wind, you get the sense that her life is over after Rhett tells her he frankly doesn't give a damn, closing the door behind him. We know she's not going to binge Netflix and eat ice cream and then get back out there. Miriam in Sons and Lovers, when her love rejects her, she grows bitter and old and then the book just ends. I like that about old novels. It's real to me. I've had 3 big loves, and I think of them every day. This one feels like my last act. I was in love, and my lover told me he wanted to see my lungs get blown out on a ventilator. I'm Scarlett O'Hara at the top of the grand staircase, one hand on the rail for support and the other clutching my bodice, trying to come to terms with the sick feeling in my stomach. Frank was crazy when he got home from the hospital. He went straight to his dad's house. I went over to check in on him and was apprehensive when I saw him through the window. Even through the glass, I could feel the air was singed or twisted with something. Granted, his father had just passed, but this was something more. He looked sinister there at the kitchen table, looking at the computer. I wanted to turn around, but he glanced up. When he opened the door, we didn't know how to greet each other. The air felt like it was on heavy caffeine. He asked about his dog and was sort of taking a step toward me, then away, then forward again, almost like he was playing tennis. Then he cut the small talk and said he was going to kill the doctor that killed his dad. There was a photo of her up on his computer. It's hard for me to explain what happened that day because it happened all day. I can't really recap the insane ramblings that came one after another. That's why anyone who I tried to tell what happened to got a different story, and I was always left feeling like I hadn't explained it right. He was springing up from his chair, pacing and plopping back down again. He talked about his own birth and how the doctors tried to kill him as he was being born. I sat very still in the high chair his dad used to sit in. Your partner's dad just died. I kept reminding myself, of course it's going to be a rough day. You have to sit here and get through it with him. I was trying to remain as calm as possible. I have a pact with the devil, Frank said. I can do whatever I want as long as I give a hint first. If I drop a hint to someone and they don't hear it, that's on them, and I won't have to pay for what happens next. He had been smoking bowl after bowl and started to pack another. How many bowls did you just have? 5? I asked him. He smiled sheepishly, and I realized he had been waiting for me to notice his attempts to drown out his pain. He liked that I cared enough to step in. How could I have let him smoke 5 bowls in half an hour? I berated myself. I need to step up here. He needs me. I need to go to the bank. He stood up. I need to get his money out before someone steals it. I didn't think it worked that way, that the first one to the bank after someone dies gets the money, but Frank was in motion and his tone was absolute. I'm going to drive you. I'm fine. You can go on home. I'm driving you, I repeated. I sat in the car outside the bank, mildly concerned I was about to be involved in a heist. Anything seemed possible at that point. He was moving at a normal speed when he came out, which was a good sign. I think they were suspicious of me, he said as he got in the car. Yeah? They said I'm not the beneficiary. They wouldn't tell me who is, but it's probably my uncle. That's why his wife suggested I bring Dad to that hospital. They wanted him dead for the money. I didn't reply. I drove him to his own house so we could check on his dog. I think we were there for an hour or two. At one point, he said something so mean that I ran up the stairs and laid in his bed under the covers. I wanted to just lay there and let time pass, but he came up to apologize and asked to be taken back to his dad's. I feel safe there. That's why I was there in the first place, he said. So we drove back over. We were both sort of wandering the house in a daze. He would yell things up at the ceiling, things for his dad to hear. He sat down on the couch in the living room. I picked up a large metal handbell. There were 2 of them, one on each side of the TV. Frank shot up from the couch, pointed a finger at me and shouted, "Don't ring that bell!" He looked so deranged, but I remember thinking in that moment, something about the way he said it, the way he was in general. I can't explain it, even to myself, but I just adored him. I rang the bell. Frank sat back down and looked straight ahead out the living room window. I came and sat next to him. You know what I wish? His voice was suddenly soft and wistful. What? I asked. I wish we were both mentally stable. It was the most real and honest thing that could have been said. A burst of emotion sprang up from my stomach, but I squeezed it tight in my throat like a snake trying to keep down a live mouse. It wasn't my day to cry. Frank's thoughtful mood was brief. Before I knew it, he was standing again and shouting. He said I had known he was sending his dad to a kill hospital, but I didn't try to stop him. He said he hated me and people like me, that we were all brainwashed. I wondered if I rang the second handbell, the one on the other side of the TV, if the shouting would stop. But it was too far away. He said he was going to avenge his father's death, that God gave him permission to murder 2 people, that he was God's chosen one, and I was a heathen. I was going to hell for sure. He told me he wanted nothing to do with me ever again, and he wanted me out of that house now. I don't know why I didn't leave. But most likely it was because I couldn't move at all. Sometime after the yelling stopped, we both fell asleep on the couch. We were exhausted, and by the time we woke, it was 7 p.m. and I realized I hadn't eaten that day. I wanted to go back to his house to eat, but he wanted to stay. He offered his dad's food, but it had gluten, which upsets my stomach. I could see in his eyes as I shook my head at the frozen meal he held up that he hated me. He hated that I was putting my stomach first. We could have parted ways, but we were feeling inexplicitly stuck together. We both needed whatever speck of comfort we were able to give to each other. I don't remember much from the second round at his house. I fell asleep at some point, and when I woke around 1 a.m., he was gone, and he was gone with my car. His was still parked at his dad's. I thought about the doctor whose life he threatened. He wouldn't really do that, would he? I tried calling him, but his phone was off. People don't really do stuff like that, I decided. People that angry kill their partners instead. Redirected anger. It's just easier. Not a comforting thought, but I somehow drifted back to sleep. When I reawoke, the sun was up, and Frank was lying next to me on his back on top of the blanket, already talking. He was talking about some Mexican father and son that were on the news in the 90s for driving around shooting people. He looked over at me. Have you told anyone that you think about suicide? Do your parents know that? I don't think about suicide. The words dribbled out of me and sounded far away. I was remembering what he had said about his pact with the devil, about how he could do what he wanted with people as long as he dropped a hint. I sprang from the bed. He leapt up too. He grabbed me in the hall and was repeating anything I said. We were both shouting, "Stop! Let go!" He loosened his grip and I wrangled free, ran downstairs, grabbed my bag, and thank God my keys were in sight on the kitchen counter. He called a bunch after I left, but I didn't pick up. Later that evening, he sent a series of texts that conveyed a couple things. 1, he was mad that I left. And 2, he was absolutely livid about something I had said in the car on our way home from the hospital the day before his dad passed. We were in the parking garage. He had offered to drive my car because I drove the Dan Ryan during rush hour while Frank rode in the ambulance with his pops. He drove up to the gate and needed the parking pass, a little slip I was given from the machine when I pulled in. I found it after digging around, handed it to him, and said, real casual like, "They're keeping him alive for you." What? After I said it, I couldn't think why I said it or what it meant. I guess I thought we were having a Magden, but now his head was cocked, his face all scrunched up, and he was looking at me incredulously. The fuck? Part 4. We avoided each other for a few months. I was taking sleeping pills but would jolt up in the night in a panicky sweat. I lost the ability to tell if I was hungry. I Googled the hospital daily. I couldn't remember the doctor's name, but no breaking news emerged, for the hospital in general. At work, I was getting mad at clients for chattering about things like gardening, movies, golf. Things I couldn't fathom caring about, but I didn't like when they were quiet either. It left too much time for thinking. After a few months passed and I wasn't feeling any better, I realized I needed to see him again. It was too sudden of a break. I thought if I saw him just once, it would help to smooth over something that felt too sharp to live with. When I went back to his house, This was when it was so filled with crap you could barely walk in any room without brushing against things on both sides. Even just opening the door to walk in, you have a square of space and a choice to turn left or right down a narrow passage lined by boxes or stacked books. My attempt to see him just once, of course, failed, and we immediately fell back into our old pattern, and for a solid month we were walking his Chihuahua, garage sailing, and even stopping at his dad's house. He had been packing up everything in that house and was trying to somehow fit every bit of it into his. The kitchen, though, he hadn't touched yet. This was where we had always sat when we came by, his dad in his chair with his whiskey soda, Frank next to him putting YouTube videos on the computer that sat on the kitchen table, and me in a chair against the wall, dog on lap and coffee in hand. It somehow felt normal to be in his kitchen watching YouTube again. To me, it felt like his dad was just in the other room. It must have felt that way for Frank, too. That's why we were there. Frank got up from his seat and placed his hands on the table for support as he leaned forward. He started complaining about his mom. I called her out the other night for making Dad pay her for half the house when she left him, and she pretended to not even remember, he said. That's why my dad had to move here. He couldn't afford to pay her all that. If she had left him alone, he'd have kept the house. We'd be there right now. I'd have inherited it, me and my brother. But instead, he spent the rest of his life paying rent, because of her. Okay, well, do you know if your mom put down for that house? I asked. She worked. Was she paying half the mortgage? Did she maybe use the money to put down for a safe home for her boys? He didn't reply to any of this. He was looking past me with a glassy stare. That's when I realized. He was still living in that house he grew up in, and also, he blamed his mom for the divorce. Of course he did. That's all that would make sense to a child. He had seen his mom take it again and again. It became normalized. So when she drew a boundary and his world crumbled, of course it appeared her doing. A kid wouldn't think, if only Dad would quit drinking, yelling, hitting, and cheating. Because this is something he'd never witnessed. It probably didn't seem possible. I held my tongue in that kitchen. There was a lot I wanted to say, but he was a grown man now. He had decided how to see things, and you can't change that for a person, especially when so much emotion is involved. I remembered the time we were looking over the fence into the backyard of his childhood home. He had pointed out to me a decaying treehouse his dad built against the side fence. He told me there used to be a ladder him and his brother could throw on the other side of the fence and climb down into a cornfield. They'd make paths in the corn that led to the state park's walking path and river. This was their playground. All that time I had spent with him, walking along that river and driving around town in his vintage convertible, wearing wide-brimmed hats and badly combed wigs as he'd stroke my arm with the flat, off his nail. That had been playtime, just one part of him. If I wanted to really be with him, I'd have to take his hand, go up the rope ladder, into the playhouse, down the other side, into the house, and lay in bed waiting for the sound of that garage door to open. I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. Pause. I wrote him an email that he probably found dramatic, but was actually a shortened, straightforward version of the one I didn't send. I blocked and then deleted his number so I couldn't unblock. I felt sad and sick since, really. I've been thinking about that summer we dated, back when I was 19. I remember I got pulled over driving to his house to give him back a DVD after we broke up. I lived way out in the country, where you could really start speeding if you lost focus, and then there'd be a tiny town and you'd have to slow down to 35 to pass through. I forgot to slow and got a reckless driving ticket. 70 in a 35. They towed my car and took my license. Would we have reconciled if I had made it to his house that day? I tried to remember what my intention was. We broke up because he lied to me about something, and my young self didn't know whether to let it go or call it out. I had called it out and was second-guessing myself. Knowing me, I was going over without a plan. I probably had some weird fantasy in my head. Like I'd give him his DVD, we'd talk a little, and then lean in for a goodbye hug. And maybe the hug would be so good that we'd hug a little too long. It would start to feel awkward, but then we'd hug straight past the awkward and just keep going. And then Christmas would come and pass. And then it would come and pass again. There'd be Christmas trees and pumpkins and eggs orbiting around us as our hair grew long and short and long and our faces changed and our spines started to curve and we'd just keep hugging until one of us went limp. I wondered if it was divine intervention that got me pulled over that day. It wouldn't have been the only time the higher powers intervened in my life with road tricks. The day I moved out of Jared's house, the day I left Portland, a friend from home had flown up to drive back with me. They were out in the driveway packing things up in my car while I roamed around the house making sure I didn't forget anything when Jared started bawling. Like truly sobbing, which was shocking to see come out of this not very emotional man that I had just spent 2 years with. In fact, that was one of our issues. I was too emotional, and he was above all that. He was standing in the living room when he erupted, and we both moved into the bedroom and sat down on the bed. He grasped his fingers tightly around my wrist, and then I was crying too, for a couple minutes, I think. Eventually, we pulled ourselves together, and I took off. I was about an hour and a half out from Portland when my friend and I stopped to use the bathroom. I pulled out my phone and saw a series of texts. Did we make a mistake? I haven't cried like this since I was a child. Please call me. I felt dizzy. What about my friend? I could pay for their plane ticket home. Would that be crazy? I had only not loved Jared because he wouldn't love me, but if he realized he did, I thought maybe I could too. How funny, I thought, as I found a spot on the side of the gas station to make a private call. Anyone who had just witnessed that scene less than 2 hours ago, me pulling out of his driveway with all my stuff and him hiding his face in his hands as he stumbled back towards his house. Anyone would have thought for sure we were breaking up. No one would have guessed that actually our relationship was just about to begin. Hello? Hey, where are you? Are you driving? He sounded out of breath. No, we just pulled over at a gas station. I'm in the Dalles. I got your texts. Oh yeah, well, something just happened. Happened, I echoed. My car got hit. Oh. I was in my living room and I heard a loud crash. So I stood up and looked out the window and saw the car speeding off. It smacked right into my car. My car is totaled, like the whole front wheel is smashed in sideways. That's crazy. You never even park there. His car was parked where mine usually was, on the side of the street, only because I needed his spot in the driveway to pack up. I know, that's the weirdest part. Hey, so, my parents just pulled up. The police are on their way. I have to file a report. Okay, call me tonight, when you get to where you're going so I know you're safe. Oh, okay, B. No one can tell me that wasn't divine intervention. What sort of bothers me, though, why are the higher powers always steering me away from everybody? Anyways, I hope you understand now why I can't talk to Frank anymore except through a wax head sitting in an imaginary version of a real house I pretend to sleep in. I never did end up saying much into that head, actually. There have been only a few times that I screamed and shook it, and I sleep in that house less as time passes. When people ask you why you're not with someone anymore, they expect you to deliver something that makes sense in a few sentences, which I was having trouble with. Even if someone is really interested, you've got maybe 4 minutes max. So I just wanted to explain the story in a full way, even if no one hears it. It's been about half a year since the last time I saw Frank, and I have spent a good chunk of that time alone. But the thing about me is, I rarely ever feel alone. Often I feel I'm standing in several houses at once, with everyone I've ever known off in another room.